In July of 2026, Tempus AI agreed to buy a company called Personalis for about $1.5 billion. Here's the strange part. Personalis, in its most recent quarter, booked just $22 million in revenue. So Tempus is paying roughly 17 times annual sales in an all-stock deal for a business that is still losing money. Wall Street's first reaction was a raised eyebrow. But look closer, and this might be one of the shrewdest moves in cancer diagnostics this year. Because Tempus isn't buying revenue. It's buying a technology, a razor-thin edge in the blood, and a business model that could quietly become the most valuable thing in oncology. Let's unpack it. First, the facts. The deal was announced on July 20th, 2026. Tempus is acquiring Personalis for about $1.5 billion in enterprise value, net of the stake it already owned, at $16.25 a share, entirely in Tempus stock. It's expected to close in late 2026 or early 2027, pending shareholder and regulatory approval. And crucially, this isn't a blind date. The two companies have been commercially entangled since November of 2023, when Tempus first invested and began helping bring Personalis' flagship test to market. So Tempus knows exactly what it's buying. The question is why it wants it so badly. To see the logic, you need to know the two players. Tempus is an artificial intelligence company built for cancer. It sequences tumors, runs diagnostics, and above all, sits on one of the largest libraries of linked clinical and molecular data in oncology, which it uses to train models and power decisions. Personalis is narrower and deeper. It has spent years perfecting a single, very hard thing, detecting the faintest possible trace of cancer in a tube of blood. One company has the platform and the data. The other has a piece of technology that platform was missing. And that missing piece has a name. Think about a cancer patient's journey in 3 acts. First, diagnosis, finding and characterizing the tumor. Second, treatment, surgery, chemotherapy, immunotherapy. And third, the part that never really ends, monitoring, watching to see whether the cancer comes back. Tempus was strong in the first 2 acts. It could help diagnose and guide treatment. But that third act, continuous monitoring after treatment, was a gap in its platform. And it's not a small gap. Monitoring is where patients spend years of their lives, and where, it turns out, a great deal of the money is. Personalis fills that gap with a category of test called molecular residual disease, or MRD. So what is molecular residual disease? When a tumor grows, it sheds tiny fragments of its DNA into the bloodstream, circulating tumor DNA. After surgery or therapy, a scan might show no visible cancer. But if even a few of those tumor DNA fragments are still circulating, the disease is still there, hiding below the resolution of any imaging machine. MRD testing hunts for exactly those fragments. Find them, and you know the cancer is likely to return, often months or even years before it would ever show up on a scan. That early warning is the whole game. And the harder you can look, the more valuable the test. This is where Personalis pulls ahead. Its test, called NeXT Personal, is what's known as tumor-informed. It first sequences the patient's own tumor across the whole genome and builds a custom fingerprint of up to roughly 1,800 mutations unique to that person's cancer. Then it watches the blood for that specific fingerprint. Because it's tracking so many targets at once, with heavy noise suppression, it can detect circulating tumor DNA at astonishing levels, below 100 parts per million. To put that in perspective, in one lung cancer study, nearly half of the cancer signals it caught after treatment were below that threshold, faint traces that less sensitive tests would simply miss. In this field, sensitivity is everything, and NeXT Personal is among the most sensitive in the world. Now, Personalis is not alone in this market. Natera Signatera is the entrenched leader, and Guardant, Exact Sciences, and others are all pushing hard. So why does one more MRD test justify a $1.5 billion bet? Because in monitoring, the ranking is basically sensitivity. The test that can see the smallest trace of returning cancer earliest wins the clinical argument, wins the guidelines, and wins the doctor's order. Personalis chose to compete on exactly that axis: ultra-sensitivity through whole genome, tumor-informed testing, and the clinical data increasingly backs it up. For Tempus, buying a differentiated, best-in-class assay is far faster than trying to build one and catch up. Of course, Tempus isn't the only one who sees this. The MRD market is a genuine race. Natera Signatera is the established leader, also tumor-informed, with a big head start in commercial volume and reimbursement. Guardant's Reveal takes a different tack, tumor-naive, meaning it skips the separate tumor sequencing step, trading some sensitivity for convenience and speed. Exact Sciences and others are circling too. So the market is splitting along a classic axis, convenience versus sensitivity. Personalis planted its flag firmly on sensitivity, betting that in cancer, catching a recurrence earlier is worth more than a simpler workflow. Whether that bet pays off depends on guidelines, data, and reimbursement. But it's a defensible place to compete, and it's exactly the capability Tempus lacked. Let's talk about the prize, the total addressable market. On paper, independent analysts size the MRD testing market at roughly $1.5 to $2 billion today, growing to somewhere between $5 and $8 billion by the early 2030s, compounding at over 10% a year. That alone is a healthy market. But the real number is bigger, and here's the subtle reason why. A diagnosis is a one-time event, one test, one payment. Monitoring is not. A single patient may be tested every few months for years after their treatment ends. Multiply a few $1,000s a test by repeated testing across millions of survivors, across every major cancer type as coverage expands and a strategic opportunity stretches well into the tens of billions. Monitoring doesn't just open a market. It opens an annuity. And that word, annuity, is the heart of why this deal makes commercial sense. A diagnostic test is transactional. A monitoring test is a subscription in all but name. Once a patient is on surveillance, the orders recur on a schedule for years, and each one is reimbursed. Personalis has already secured multiple Medicare coverage decisions across breast and lung cancer, which is the hard-won key that turns a clever test into a paid, repeatable revenue stream. Layer on pharmaceutical partnerships, where drug makers pay to use MRD as an endpoint in their trials, and you have 3 revenue engines. But there's a fourth, invisible one. Every test generates longitudinal data, the same patient's cancer tracked over time, which is exactly the fuel Tempus's artificial intelligence runs on. So put yourself in Tempus's seat. You want recurring revenue instead of one-time tests. You want a best-in-class monitoring asset without spending years building it. You want to complete your platform, so you own the patient from diagnosis through treatment, all the way through years of monitoring. And above all, you want the continuous stream of longitudinal molecular data that monitoring uniquely produces, because that data makes every model you own smarter and harder for anyone to compete with. Personalis delivers all 4 at once. And since Tempus had already partnered with them for 2 years, the integration risk is low. This isn't a gamble on a stranger. It's buying out a partner you already trust. Which brings us to the honest, harder question. Is monitoring really as valuable as diagnosis? Clinically, the answer is nuanced. MRD is powerfully prognostic. If the test is positive, the cancer very often comes back, and it flags that risk earlier than any scan. That's real. But knowing sooner only matters if acting sooner changes the outcome. And that final piece, proof that intervening on an MRD signal actually helps patients live longer, is still being established in clinical trials. So clinically, monitoring is not a replacement for diagnosis. It's a powerful complement, and it's rapidly becoming standard of care. Commercially, though, it may be the better business of the two, recurring, sticky, data-rich, and expanding. Diagnosis finds the customer. Monitoring keeps them. Now, no deep dive is complete without the risks, and this deal has several. It's all stock, so Tempus is diluting its own shareholders to pay for it, a bet that its shares are worth spending. Integrating 2 companies and 2 lab operations is never as smooth as the press release. The clinical case for MRD, remember, is still maturing. If trials fail to show that acting on these signals extends lives, adoption could stall. There's regulatory uncertainty around how these lab-developed tests are overseen. And the competition, Natera especially, is not standing still. None of these are deal breakers, but they're the reasons a smart investor watches execution closely, and the reasons this $1.5 billion bet is exactly that, a bet. So, why did Tempus pay $1.5 billion for a company earning $22 million a quarter? Because it wasn't buying this quarter. It was buying a differentiated technology, a recurring revenue model, and a data engine, all wrapped around a simple bet. that the future of cancer care is not a single snapshot at diagnosis, but a continuous signal, watch for life. If that bet is right, Tempus didn't overpay. It bought the next decade of oncology, one drop of blood at a time. Thanks for watching. This has been a Life Sciences AI commercial deep dive.